Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of Andy's Murder Radio. Sorry we had to take a week break. I learned from my mistakes, and that last chair I got was really squeaky, and while editing it, it was super annoying. Not going to get into it, but got a new chair. We're fine. Before we start, though, I did want to let everybody know, like I do every single episode, we are going to be talking about murder and scary stuff. So if you have kids in the car or if you don't like that stuff, just skip on to whatever you're going to listen to next. Alrighty, and the cool thing is we had a really, really good suggestion from my friend Josh Luce. He's like, you should do a ranking system. And I'm learning about a lot of these murders for the first time while doing these episodes. I've never been into scary movies. I've never really been into this type of stuff, so that's why I kind of wanted to do it, to learn more about it. So I'm going to start ranking them at the end of every episode. And then maybe after a few, then I'll put them in a tier system, something along those lines. And then, by the end of season 1, we'll figure out who the worst serial killer is of season 1. So the ranking system is going to be based on brutality, I think social impact, the victim count, the nickname, and their overall looks. Because I think how scary somebody looks, like the BTK killer, that guy looks scary as shit. Like, you could just tell that he was going to be a murderer. Like, that guy was awful looking. But someone like Ted Bundy, who's pretty good looking, it could kind of, so maybe the looks will rank higher for BTK because he was so creepy looking, or maybe it'll rank higher for Ted Bundy because then he could lure people in easier because of his good looks. So I don't know. We're just gonna play it by ear. But today we have another piece of shit, another murderer named Dayton Leroy Rogers. Some people might know him as the Molalla Killer. I'm kind of doing an Oregon one today because I'm from Oregon. So I was like, why not? I'll do some Oregon killers. Maybe to, I don't know, spread some light, I guess. I don't know. All right. So this Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dayton Leroy Rogers. He was born September 30th, 1953 in Moscow, Idaho. Crazy. Did not know there was another Moscow in America. Odd. But he was born into a world of chaos and conflict. His earliest memories were filled with harsh sounds of his father's drunken rages, the clatter of broken dishes, the sobs of his mother trying to shield him and his siblings from the violence. So just growing up with that, probably not going to turn out good for this kid. His father was a man who was ruled by his addiction to alcohol. A lot of times he would return home just like pissed off and angry, ready to unleash his pent-up frustrations on his family. A lot of times Dayton would just lie awake at night, clutching his blanket, his heart pounding. He's listening to the familiar, terrifying sounds of his parents fighting in the next room. And then the next morning, he would see the bruises on his mother's face and all the shattered dishes and all the shattered picture frames around the house, and then you just, all his fears were just awoken because he could see the actual remnants of the night before. But despite the chaos at home, Dayton's mother did try her best to provide some kind of normalcy for her children. She would take them to church, hoping to instill some sense of morality and peace. But the contrast between the peaceful sermons and the violent reality at home only added to Dayton's confusion and anger. And for some kids, schools, you can help out. You get some normalcy, you get some teachers you like. But unfortunately, school was no refuge for Dayton. He struggled academically. He found it difficult to concentrate in class, probably due to all the stress at home. And all the kids could tell that he was different. He was often the target of bullying, physical, verbal bullying. The confrontations he faced at school mirrored kind of the violence he witnessed at home. So it's just like nonstop, just violence. That really reinforced his sense of isolation and anger. Teachers noticed his behavior problems, his quick temper, his tendency to lash out, but their interventions were ineffective against the deep-seated issues that he was carrying due to all the childhood trauma. He did find solace in solitude, though. He was often wandering the woods near his home. The solitary excursions provided a temporary escape from the chaos of his daily life, but they also became the breeding ground for darker thoughts. He began experimenting cruelty to animals. I'm seeing a theme here. Disturbing behavior that went unnoticed in the absence of any meaningful adult supervision or intervention. As Dayton entered his teenage years, his behavior grew more erratic and troubling. He began engaging in petty crimes, shoplifting, vandalism, minor thefts, things like that. Those actions seemed to be cries of help, from a young man trying to battle his inner demons. Maybe he wanted some kind of stability. I don't know. His encounters with law enforcement became more frequent, each arrest a step further down a dark path. At 19, Dayton's violent tendencies escalated dramatically. In 1972, he attacked a 15-year-old girl with a knife, an act of brutality that shocked even those familiar with his troubled history. He was arrested for attempted murder. Dayton showed no remorse. His face, just a mask of indifference as he faced the consequences of his actions. The incident marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, I think one that is defined by escalating violence and cruelty. And, just like kind of everybody else that we've talked about so far, Dayton Leroy Rogers' childhood was a grim prelude to the horrors he would later inflict as the Molalla Forrest Killer. The instability, the abuse he endured at home, combined with the early signs of aggression and lack of positive intervention, shaped him to be a man capable of unmanageable violence. His story is a chilling reminder of the profound impact of that a toxic and abusive upbringing can have on one's future. Okay, now this is basically where the beginning of the nightmare starts. By the mid-1980s, Dayton Leroy Rogers had already established a pattern of violence and cruelty. His encounters with the law had become more frequent, but they barely even scratched the surface of his true depravity. Rogers targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers, whom he would lure with promises of money and companionship. His outward appearance, just an average person. He was described as somewhat charming though, but the charming and the just normal appearance kind of masked the dark intentions that he really had. The victims. Like I said before, the women who fell prey to Rogers were often those kind of society would overlook. They were women struggling with addiction, poverty, homelessness, and unfortunately, with those, it kind of makes them easy targets because people aren't really paying attention to them. If a homeless person does disappear, who's gonna, nobody's gonna bat an eye. Unfortunately, that's but yeah. A lot of times he would basically just tell them that he could help them with whatever they're dealing with. But as we are going to find out, that was just for a brief moment. And turned out, Rogers would pick them up in his truck, driving them to secluded areas where no one else could hear their screams. The Molalla Forest became Rogers' gruesome hunting ground. He would take his victims deep into the woods where he felt secure enough to unleash his full brutality. There, his demeanor would shift from superficially kind to monstrously violent. Rogers' preferred method of murder was to bind his victims, often with their own clothing or items he brought along, and then subjected them to horrifying torture. He used knives to inflict excruciating pain, stabbing and cutting his victims repeatedly. The sheer brutality of his attacks indicated a deep-seated rage and a sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. So there's a few victims. Maureen Ann Hodges, she was 26 years old. The date of death is 1987. Maureen was found with multiple stab wounds. Her body was discovered in the Molalla Forest, and the body showed signs of torture and severe violence. Then we get another one in 1987, Rita Lavelle Jolly. Rita was found again in the Molalla Forest with numerous stab wounds, and just like before, her body showed evidence of having been subjected to extreme cruelty. Lisa Marie Mock, 23 years old, date of death 1987 again. Again, just like the other ones, Lisa's body was discovered in the Molalla Forest with multiple wounds, and they could tell that she was tortured and brutally murdered. And then we have Nani Cervantes, 26 years old, date of death in 1987. Just like the previous women, stab wounds and torture and violence and cruelty. We have Christine Lotus Adams, 35 years old, 1987 again for the date of death. Christine was discovered with multiple stab wounds and subjected to significant torture, cruelty. And now we have Cynthia DeVore, 20 years old, 1987, date of death. Cynthia's body was found in Molalla Forest with numerous stab wounds. The extent of her injuries indicated prolonged and severe torture. And we also have Gina Berghardt, 1987. She was 18 years old. Gina was found with multiple stab wounds in the Molalla Forest. Her body showed signs of brutal torture and violence. So this person, Dayton Leroy Rogers, definitely had a way he did this, and it seems like every single one was about the same. His approach to killing was methodical and sadistic. He would pick up his victims, like I said, often sex workers, in his truck and drive them to the secluded areas. Once there, he would bind them with ropes, clothing, other materials, just so they couldn't escape. He really did use a knife. I guess he liked to inflict the numerous stab wounds on his victims just to kind of make it worse. The level of violence and the pattern of the wounds indicated Roger took pleasure in causing extreme pain and suffering before his victims succumbed to their injuries. So in August 1987, the horrors of Rogers' actions began to surface. There was a man searching for cans, and he ended up stumbling upon human remains in the dense underbrush of the Molalla Forest. Authorities were called, and as they began to investigate, they uncovered a grisly scene: the bodies of several women in various stages of decomposition. They were all found scattered in the area. Each victim bore the brutal marks of Rogers' sadistic methods: multiple stab wounds, signs of torture, and evidence of a violent struggle. So on August 7th, my dad's birthday, 1987, Dayton Leroy Rogers was apprehended in a parking lot after attempting to dispose of a body of a woman he had attacked. The woman, who had managed to survive the initial assault, provided crucial information to the police, which linked Rogers to the series of murders. And then they found his truck, and his truck was stained with blood, and they contained tools that he would use for torturing, and that became basically the most vital piece of evidence against him. Rogers' trial began in 1988, and it drew significant media attention. Due to the horrific nature of his crimes, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including the testimonies of surviving victims and forensic evidence linking him to the murders. And in the 80s, forensic stuff was still pretty new, so, that's good. I'm glad we have that now. The testimonies painted a chilling picture of Rogers as a sadistic killer who took pleasure in the prolonged suffering of his victims. In 1989, Dayton Leroy Rogers was convicted of multiple counts of aggravated murder. The jury found him guilty of the murders of several women whose bodies had been discovered in the Molalla Forest. The court sentenced him to death, recognizing the extreme brutality and sadism involved in the crimes. Rogers showed little remorse during this trial. He maintained a cold and indifferent demeanor the entire time. But following his conviction, Rogers engaged in numerous legal battles to overturn his death sentence. His defense team filed multiple appeals, arguing various points of law and procedure in an attempt to have his sentence reduced or the conviction overturned. These appeals dragged on for years, contributing to the lengthy process often associated with the death penalty cases in the United States. Rogers has spent decades on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary. And during his time, he lived under the strict condition typical of the death row inmates, including solitary confinement. For much of the day, his time in prison has been marked by occasional legal filings and the ongoing psychological toll of his impending execution. But there have been some kind of recent developments. As of now, Dayton Leroy Rogers remains on death row. His appeals continue to make their way through the legal system, reflecting the complexities and delays of often inherent in death penalty cases. Despite the legal numerous maneuvers, his conviction and death sentence have been upheld multiple times. Don't see that changing anytime soon. But I do think it's important to talk about the impact on victims, families, and just the community in whole. The aftermath of Rogers' crimes extended far beyond his incarceration. The families of his victims continue to grapple with the grief and trauma of losing their loved ones, and especially in such a brutal manner, too. The community of Molalla and the broader region remain haunted by the memory of his crimes, which serve as a grim reminder of the potential of human cruelty. So, Dayton Leroy Rogers' life after the murders has been defined by his arrest, trial, and subsequent conviction for one of Oregon's most notorious series of murders. His time on death row is a testament to the severity of his crimes and the enduring impact they have had on the victims' families and the community. While he does remain alive, his legacy is one of horror and profound loss, a dark chapter in criminal history. So I've never heard about this killer until I started doing research, and I live in Oregon, and so, like, I don't live that far from. Let's see how far I live. So I live 45 minutes away from Molalla, and I've never heard about this killer until I started this whole podcast. So that is going to affect my ranking system, because you think being 45 minutes away, it would you'd know more about it. But also, again, like I said, I've never been into this stuff. So the ranking system, we're going to start with brutality, and it's going to be out of 10 except for the victim count. The victim count is going to be whatever number the victim is, and then at the end, I think we're just going to add everything up, and that's how we're going to rank these, I guess. So the brutality, I think it's awful. I think anytime you're just using a knife to torture and everything, I can't even imagine what that would be like, that pain and everything. So I'm going to have to give that a 9. And being tied up and helpless and getting stabbed, it's fucking awful. Like, yeah, I can't even think about that. So I'm going to give the brutality a 9. I'm going to give the impact, it's going to be a little bit lower. It's going to be a 5, just because I feel like a lot of people who are into these types of murders know about this person. But I would assume I would have heard about this. He's still alive. It's 45 minutes away from kind of where I grew up. So, yeah, I just would have assumed I would have heard about it. So, yeah, no, I mean, it was in the late 80s. So, I mean, it was a while ago. But I just feel like I would have heard about it. I don't know. So, yeah, I'm going to give it a 5. The victim count, it looks like there were 7 victims. So, the 7, that's also just awful. Horrible, awful number. The nickname, I'm going to give it kind of like a 2 out of 10, because that's kind of a whack nickname. I think like Molalla stands for like prairie ground or like brush prairie or something like that. So BTK killer, if you're going to be a murderer, that's a dope name, BTK, But Molalla Forrest Killer, it sounds like you're just like really like you're a lumberjack or something. So no, I'm going to give that a 2 out of 10. Looks, this man, they said he was pretty average, but, I don't think so. I think I don't think he was attractive. So I think he looked pretty creepy to begin with too. So I'm going to give him, look-wise, give him a 3, I guess. I mean, he's not like a hideous beast, but he just looks pretty awkward. So we have 14, plus 7 is 21, plus 2 is 23, plus 3 is 26. So the Molalla Forrest Killer gets a 26 rating, 26 for murder rating. I might change his name later on, but I like that we're doing this ranking system. Thank you, Josh. It's a good idea. But yeah, so that's this episode. First time hearing about him. Let me know what you thought of, or if you have any memories of this killer growing up, or if you heard about this or anything. I'd like to hear about it. Or if you have another subject or another person you want me to do, let me know. And thank you so much for listening to Andy's Murder Radio. We really appreciate it. Maybe tell a friend about this. It's going to get better every episode. I know they're kind of funky to begin with, but I'm kind of learning the process. We're gonna have this tier system, the rank system, which I think is gonna be a lot of fun. Tell me, if you agree with the ranking, if you don't agree with the ranking. I do want to thank Night Lizard. Thank you so much for letting us use your music. It's freaking great. Brandon, the lead singer of Night Lizard, has another band called Stress Test. They're really dope, especially if you like punk and hardcore. Check them out. But until next time, it's been Andy with Andy's Murder Radio, and don't go killing anybody. Nope, don't kill anybody. Just let that shit go. That shit's awful. So, goodbye.